Well, good morning, Bentonville Church. It's great to have you back again with us for the Sunday morning class on the life of Elijah. I hope you are excited to dig into today's story. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 17 to begin, and then into chapter 18 as we continue on. And if you don't know any other story from Elijah's life, this is probably the one that you have heard before. The story of the showdown on top of a mountain is where we're going to spend most of our time today. But I want to start with a question. I want you to think for a second. What have been some of the spiritual highlights in your life? What have been some of the spiritual highlights in your life? That time when God seemed more real to you than ever before. When your faith seemed the strongest, the most affirmed, the most resilient. When you felt closer to God than you had before. When are some times that you felt like God was powerfully working in your life? I want you just to take a moment and jot those down, just to have it in front of you. Think about what happened, what was going on in your life. What was it about that time that made you think God is here, God is real? Because those moments serve as landmarks in our life when times get tough. Those are the moments that I personally turn around and go back to remind myself that God is there, that God is faithful, that God is still working. Those serve as the milestones and the markers that remind me, looking back, about God's faithfulness and allow me to chart a path forward. And today's stories, the two that we're going to look at, are two of those moments in the life of Elijah. These are the spiritual landmarks for Elijah's life that I think he will often turn back to remind himself that God is good. I want to think back to last week for a moment and just summarize the life of Elijah the Tishbite. There's very little that we know about Elijah, right? I mean, we don't know what tribe he's from. We don't know who his parents are. We don't know whether he is married or unmarried. We don't know what age he is. We don't know very much about his life at all. What we do know is that God raises him up as a prophet to minister before the court of Ahab and then Queen Jezebel. These are the king and queen of Israel who have brought the people into idolatry. It's Ahab who builds a temple to Baal in Samaria, the capital. It's Jezebel who leads him to do it. They are paying for the prophets and priests and priestesses out of their own pocket. Really not out of their pocket, out of the treasury of the people themselves. And I want us to stop and think for a moment, what would cause the people of Israel to give up worshiping Yahweh at the bequest of their king and queen? But the real question we should be asking is probably this: how dedicated were the hearts of the people to Yahweh in the first place? You see, the people had always struggled with syncretism. Syncretism is when you take kind of conflicting beliefs or two different systems of thought and belief and you meld them into one. Whenever you take different ideas that might not always work together and then kind of work them into a system where they work in some ways. Think of it this way: when Jeroboam broke away and made the northern kingdom of Israel, the first thing he wanted to do was to make sure the people didn't have to go south to Jerusalem to worship in the temple. So instead, he didn't call the people to stop worshiping Yahweh, but he set up two rival points of worship, one at Dan in the far north and one at Bethel in the far south. And he set up two golden calves, one at each, so that the people could go there to worship Yahweh. They wouldn't have to go to Jerusalem. And then the people also set up high places and as places of worship near their own towns and cities. And then people had kind of their own family altars where they would worship to God, but then other kind of household deities as well. And what we find is that the people, their hearts, while they worshiped Yahweh, were never totally invested in him. Yes, God was God, but these other deities had to be appeased or placated and kept happy. And then the people probably also just went along with those in positions of power. We want to worship Yahweh, but the king and queen, they worship Baal and Asherah, and we don't want to rock the boat. We want to go along to get along. And really the fastest way to get ahead might just be to play the power games that the politicians are asking us to play. And so Elijah delivers a message from Yahweh to say it's not going to rain until God says it will. And then Elijah goes from his home actually to Jezebel's home or close to it. He finds himself in the region of Sidon in the Phoenician territory in a small town called Zarephath. And there he is living in the house of a widow who is helping kind of provide for his needs. This widow has a son that she loves, that is kind of her whole world. This widow provides food and lodging for Elijah, and God takes care of her. And that's where our story begins today. What we find is the mistress of the house has the son who becomes ill. And his illness is so severe that there's no breath left in him, is what the text says. And that line is difficult to read, isn't it? In light of some of our current events, and in light of COVID, in light of the statements about I can't breathe, that line, no breath left in him, tells us that this son has died. And the woman is distraught, and she's angry, and she goes to Elijah, and she says, "What have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son?" She is frustrated. She is sad. She is grieving. She is distraught. And she doesn't know what to do. This is in chapter 17, verse 19. But he said to her, "Give me your son." And then he took her from her bosom, carried him up to the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him upon his own bed. And then Elijah begins to pray. He stops and he cries out to the Lord, and he says this, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by killing her son?" And Elijah's prayer there is pretty raw. It's in many ways, while it's one sentence, it's hard to read, isn't it? And what I love about Elijah's prayer is this, that he shows us that grief is normal, that it's natural, that denial and anger and bargaining are all part of the grief process. And Elijah reminds us that lament isn't an absence of faith, but it's a response of faith. Elijah stops and he laments and he prays. And then it says he stretches himself out upon the child 3 times and cries out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And this word here for breath, for life, is the idea of God is restoring that which makes us whole, which makes us human. God himself is bringing the breath of life back into this child. And Elijah takes this child, brings him down from the upper chamber of the house, gives him back to his mother, and then says, "See, your son is alive." And the beauty here is that death doesn't win. That something that seemed hopeless and helpless and beyond control, when they gave it over to God, death didn't win the day. And the woman responds with a message of deep faith. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." What I love is that this isn't the first time she's seeing God's faithfulness. Indeed, every single day she's seeing God's faithfulness, as that little bit of oil and that tiny bit of flour never run out. They always have the food they need to continue eating. Each day she gets a remembrance that God is faithful. But the same thing happens in my own life. I need to be reminded constantly that God is faithful, that God is there, that God cares. And this moment is one in which her faith takes another leap forward. Now I know that God is working and that you are a man of his, and when you speak, God is at work. This is a signpost for her faith, but I think this becomes a signpost also for Elijah's faith, as he sees when he prays, God does something incredible, that God is faithful with him and to him. We don't know how long all of this is taking place in kind of the timeline here, but we do hear this. This is in verse 1 of chapter 18. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year of the drought, saying, Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. Now, God has proven himself to Elijah time and time again, but here God is asking him to do something difficult. He asks him to return to Israel. And we don't get the backstory here. We only get it in just a moment. But ever since the rains have stopped coming, Jezebel has been looking for Elijah to end his life. They want to hunt down this man of God to get all of the things that are happening reversed. They want the rains to come back. And she thinks by capturing him, maybe she can force him to prophesy the rains to return. Or by taking his life, that will make Baal happy, it will appease his wrath, and then Baal will make the rain return. God calls for Elijah to do something dangerous. Go back to Israel. Present yourself in front of the very person looking to kill you. And I think that would be hard. But in verse 2, we're told Elijah went and presented himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab summoned Obadiah, who is in charge of the palace. Now Obadiah revered the Lord greatly. When Jezebel was killing off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets, hid them 50 to a cave, and provided them with bread and water. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the wadis. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive, and not lose some of the animals. So they divided the land between them to pass through it. Ahab went in one direction, and Obadiah went in another by himself. And we meet this man that we don't encounter any other time except for the very next story that comes. But we meet a man by the name of Obadiah. Now, church history is kind of divided on whether this is the Obadiah who has a book in the Bible named after him or not. I believe that the Obadiah who has a book in the Bible named after him is alive during the time of Jeremiah, about 250 years later. He is watching the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jewish tradition and the Orthodox Christian Church disagrees and says this Obadiah is the same one who writes the book in the minor prophets that we read. We don't really know. Honestly, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But we're told this, Obadiah revered the Lord greatly. Obadiah has a position of power. He is in the king's confidence. He has trust. He has a position of authority. But Obadiah risks it all, although covertly, not overtly, but risks it to save the lives of some of God's prophets. If Obadiah had been caught, we don't know what would have happened, but he definitely would have lost his position. He would have lost his power. He probably would have lost his life. But Obadiah went out of his way to protect God's prophets. There's a scholar by the name of Peter Leithart who compares Obadiah and Elijah, saying that they're both faithful servants, but they have radically different ways in which their position and modes of service take place. You see, Elijah confronts Ahab from outside of the court. He continues to come in and to present a prophetic word to Ahab, to Jezebel, and then he leaves to continue his ministry elsewhere. Obadiah works almost in the opposite. He works in that position of power. He works to be kind of just a calming and more covert influence, bringing about kind of a daily prophetic voice within Ahab's court, providing wisdom and counsel and care. We know one more than the other, but it is quite possible that Ahab's heart is a little more soft than Jezebel's because Obadiah is there daily, presenting a word from the Lord. But we're told this, Obadiah is sent out on a mission, and while he is on his way, Elijah meets him. This is in verse 7. Obadiah recognizes him, falls on his face, and says, "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" And Elijah answered him, "It is I. Go and tell your master that Elijah is here." And Obadiah said, "How have I sinned that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to have me killed?" As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom to which my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say, he is not here, he would require an oath of that kingdom or nation that they have not found you. Obadiah clues us in as to what is happening. Ahab is looking for him everywhere. He wants to hunt down Elijah. He's settling for all these other prophets. But Ahab is willing to go to war if anybody is hiding Elijah. And Obadiah here is afraid for his life. If I go back and say, I have found Elijah, he's on his way, but you don't show up, I'm the one who's going to die. But Elijah says this. I'm sorry, I'm having to look down at my notes. There's a little bit more here. He said, Obadiah is afraid that the Spirit of the Lord will take Elijah away to protect him, and that's why he is afraid. But Elijah says, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself before Ahab today. Obadiah has been working behind the scenes, yet he is also afraid. He is afraid of what Ahab will do if Elijah isn't where Obadiah says. He is afraid of the official reaction. But Elijah says, God is bringing about this showdown. As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will show myself to him today. This is very similar wording to the first time that Elijah shows up in front of Ahab, where he says, as surely as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, there will be no rain. And now he says, I am going to be in that court this morning. So Obadiah goes, he finds Ahab, he tells him, and Ahab goes to find Elijah. And when Ahab finds Elijah, in verse 17, Ahab says to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah answers, I have not troubled Israel. This is not my fault, but you have in your father's house because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore have all of Israel assemble for me at Mount Carmel with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asher who eat at Jezebel's table. He says, we have a showdown coming. This is a showdown between Baal and Asherah and Yahweh. It's also a showdown between Elijah on one hand and the idols' prophets on the other. And it's a showdown between Elijah on one hand and Ahab and Jezebel on the other. And what's going to be the outcome? We have these priests and prophets of Baal and Asherah who are going to show up. And last week we just kind of touched on these two briefly, but Baal is a term that means Lord. And so you have Baal connected to other terms and titles. And we're not certain if those are different gods or if they are the same God being described in different ways. But the story goes like this. In the ancient Near East, there was a creator god by the name of El. And El had a wife by the name of Asherah, who was a fertility goddess. And between them, they gave birth to many of the gods, including one who was called Baal. You'll also hear his name pronounced Baal, both of which are correct. Now, many scholars think there were really only one Baal, but who manifested himself as these different Baals in different times and places. Over the years, as kind of their worship went on, El faded away, and Baal rose to the position of prominence. He became the dominant deity. And the story goes that Baal won his prominence by defeating all of these other gods and goddesses, including the god of the sea. Sea represented chaos for the people, and so Baal becomes the corraler of chaos. He also defeats the god of storms, of rain and thunder and lightning, and takes away that god's power for himself. And he overcomes the god of death. And then the story goes that Baal's victory over death was repeated each year as he returns from the land of death, bringing rain to renew the earth's fertility. So this is kind of their story of why the seasons came to be. Now, Hebrew culture had viewed the sea and storms as forces of evil and chaos. And so Baal's promise to prevent storms and control the sea, as well as his ability to produce these abundant harvests, are what really make him attractive to the Israelites. It's hard to know why Israel doesn't see that Yahweh is the one who has power over these things, as he's proven it to them time and time again. That God had provided water, that God parted the sea, that God corralled chaos, God led them into the land. but it's possible that the fact that they encountered God in the desert is what causes them to kind of doubt God's sovereignty to bring about fertility. Maybe it's just the sinful practices we'll look at in just a second that attracted them to Baal. Whenever you see Baal portrayed, he is always portrayed typically as a man with the head and horns of a bull. In his right hand, or sometimes in both hands, he holds a lightning bolt, signifying both destruction and fertility. Baal is typically shown in two ways. He is either striding forward, or he is seated on a throne, possibly as the king or the lord of the gods. And always coupled with him then is the goddess Asherah. She is honored as a fertility goddess in different forms with varying names. The Bible never actually describes the goddess, but archaeologists have found figurines that are believed to portray representations of her. Asherah is typically shown as a nude female, sometimes pregnant, and holding symbols of her fertility that she promises to her followers. The Bible indicates that she was celebrated near trees and poles called Asherah poles. Places like Deuteronomy 7 and 12, 2 Kings 16 and 17, Jeremiah 3, Ezekiel 6, and a host of other places talk about what these Asherah poles were. And while these two deities are often coupled together in the Bible, their worship takes place predominantly separately as far as we can tell. Baal is mostly worshipped in temples. Asherah is worshipped at a pole set on a hilltop. Baal worship involved sacrifice of incense or the sacrifice of animals like sheep and bulls and possibly pigs. But at times of crisis, followers of Baal would often sometimes sacrifice their children to gain the god's recognition or approval. They would give up their own children. Asherah, meanwhile, was worshipped in part through sex. Cultic priests and priestesses were more like prostitutes, reenacting the Asherah and Baal coupling with worshipers who have come to ensure fertility, whether that's for their land or their flocks or their families. And what we have here is a showdown between God and these false gods the people worship. And the question is, who are you going to worship? Which gods really have real power? Which gods represent life and death? Which gods deserve the hearts of the people? Which gods have shown up time and time again for Israel, and which gods have been silent? And it's also a political showdown between Ahab and Jezebel, who might reign on the throne. But this story is going to remind us that they aren't the ones in control. So Ahab calls for all the Israelites. They assemble below at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is actually more of a mountain range than one mountain peak. In fact, there are multiple peaks to this mountain range. A couple of pictures are showing up here on the screen, but there's kind of a natural valley and amphitheater down below. And that's probably where Elijah assembles with the people. And Elijah stands in front of all those who assemble, the people of Israel as well as these priests and prophetess, and he says, how long are you going to go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord Yahweh is God, then follow him, but if Baal is, then follow him. The people don't say a word. And Elijah says, look, I am the only one left, which we learn later isn't actually true. But Elijah's the only one willing to stand up here and to put his life on the line. He says, I'm the only one left, and all these others number 450 plus 400 others. So he says, here's what we're going to do. Let's see which God here is real. Because since the time of Joshua, where he says, choose this day whom you're going to serve, we've never really made that choice. So who are you going to worship? So we're going to take two bulls. We're both going to sacrifice them. We're going to let the priests of Baal and Asherah build an altar. They're going to do their thing. I'm going to build an altar to Yahweh. And we're going to see whichever God answers with fire, that's the God that you should serve. And so that's what happens. These 850 priests and prophets build their altar and they begin their worship. They begin to pray. They do whatever it takes to get their deity's attention. They sing, they chant, they pray, and they do that for a few hours. And when that doesn't work, they step it up a notch. They cry out, "O Baal, answer us." And when there is no voice, when there is no answer, they dance in front and around their altar. And then they begin to do whatever else it takes. But as Baal never answers, Elijah begins to taunt them. He says this, "Shout louder. Surely Baal is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's asleep and you're just not being loud enough. Maybe if you shout a little louder, he will wake up." And so they try. And in order to get their God's attention, they begin to cut themselves. And their blood flows freely for hours on end. But there is no response until the time for evening sacrifice, somewhere around 4 to 5 p.m. And I love this statement that the writer in 1 Kings makes. This is in verse 29, the second part. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. The writer of 1 Kings here isn't saying that no one cared. He's saying there's no one home. Then Elijah says to all the people, "Come here to me." This is the time of evening sacrifice, the time at which at the end of the day the priest would offer a sacrifice on behalf of the people. And Elijah repairs an altar of the Lord that evidently had been here before, but had been torn down, we're told in verse 30. So he takes 12 stones, one for each of the tribes who had descended from Jacob, which is interesting because there are only 10 tribes in this northern kingdom. But Elijah reminds them, this is the God of our people, all of our people. So he takes these 12 stones and he builds an altar in the name of Yahweh. But he doesn't stop there. Then he digs a trench around that altar and tells us it's large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. It's just gallons upon gallons. Then he arranges wood on top of it. He sacrifices the bull, lays it on top of the wood, and then he asks for something strange. He says, "Fill 4 large jugs with water and pour it over the offering and the wood." These are large kind of ceremonial jars. They go and they fill it up. There's a spring not far. If this kind of this amphitheater we showed earlier, this valley is where this takes place. They take these 4 jars, they fill them up, they bring them back, they dump it over, and it's just soaked. And then Elijah says, "You know what? Do it again." They go and they do it again, and now the water is just pouring down over the edges and starting to fill up that trench. Then Elijah says, "Do it a 3rd time." They go, they fill them up, they haul them back, they dump it again, and we're told the water runs down the altar, fills up the trench. It's overflowing from the sides. There is no way if you light a match, you are going to get this thing to catch on fire. And then Elijah stops, and he prays. And this is the word of his prayer. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know you, Yahweh, our God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Elijah here is asking God to do the impossible. This isn't going to catch on fire by itself. This is going to take fire from heaven, what we might call a thunderbolt. And Elijah goes above and beyond to prove this isn't his doing, that God can do things that people would never, ever dream. And Elijah's prayer isn't so much that he would be famous, that he would be known. It's not that people will know how close we are. It's simply that they will know that you are God, that there is no other God in Israel, that you are the one that we should worship, and I am just your servant. So my hope, my prayer is that the people will know that you are God and know that you are the one bringing their hearts back towards you. And I'm challenged by that because I need that to be the prayer in my own life and ministry. A reminder that this isn't about me. This is all about God. And that I just get to be his servant and hopefully be a part of God turning people's hearts back towards him. And as Elijah finishes his prayer, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifices, but not just consuming the bull, but also the wood. And not just the wood, but then the stones and the soil and all the water around it. And when the people saw this, they fell down on their faces and they cried out, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. And then Elijah says, surround and seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. And for many, this is a very hard part of the story. Because Elijah then has them kill these prophets and priests of Baal and Asherah. But ridding the land of this worship requires some pretty extreme measures. And Jewish thought is recorded in something called the Mishnah. And we're told in the Mishnah that there are 3 sins that ought to be resisted to the point of death. And if they are done, they are the 3 sins then that bring about death as punishment. Those 3 are idolatry, adultery, and murder. And we see actually all 3 in this story. The people are worshiping Baal and Asherah, not Yahweh. The people are committing spiritual adultery with them, but also if they're worshiping Asherah, there's physical adultery, sexual adultery going on as well. And then we've seen murder as the prophets of Yahweh have been killed in Israel at the hand and the bequest of Ahab and Jezebel. And the very same thing that has been happening to the prophets of Yahweh then happened here to the prophets of Baal. Because the 10 Commandments had said this, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, so you shall have no other gods before me. Don't make an image of any form of anything in heaven above or on earth below or the waters even beneath that. Don't bow down and worship them, because Yahweh, your God, is a jealous God. And what's incredible to me here is Ahab's response. Honestly, he doesn't have one. He's dumbfounded. And we'll see Jezebel's response next week. But Elijah goes over to Ahab and he says, do this. Go eat and drink. Go do what it is you're best at. Go be comfortable. For we're about to have the sound of a heavy rain. And we don't have any response. We don't have any words. All we're told is this in verse 42. So Ahab went off to eat and drink. But Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, put his face between his knees, and begins to pray. There's one of his servants there with him. This could be a servant who kind of sees to his needs, or this could be another prophet. But this servant, after Elijah's been praying for a while, he tells him, go and look out towards the sea. He's probably climbed up to the top of Mount Carmel, which is not far from the top. You can see out across the Mediterranean. The servant comes back and says, there's nothing there. And Elijah prays again and again. 7 times Elijah prays and then sends his servant back. And on the 7th time, the servant says, well, now I see a small cloud, just as small as a man's hand, rising up out of the sea. So Elijah tells the servant, go and tell Ahab, stop eating and drinking, hitch up your chariot, and get out of here, because the rain is going to bog you down if you don't. And the sky then is growing black with clouds. The wind rises. A heavy rain starts to fall as Ahab roars off and rode off towards Jezreel. But here's something incredible. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. He outruns horses and chariot. Now, I'm a runner. I'm not a fast one, not a particularly good one. I just kind of plod along. But I love that Elijah here is a runner. But what we see is Elijah's first response always is to pray. Elijah's first response is to pray. We saw that with the dead son of the widow in Zarephath. Elijah took the boy and he prayed. We see that as Elijah stands in front of the people. Elijah prays. And Elijah doesn't just go up on the mountain and then sit and wait. No, he spends all of that time praying, even knowing that God is going to act. We have this beautiful picture here as we get kind of this finale. Baal is always pictured as riding on the clouds, but it's Yahweh who brings the clouds out of the sea. Baal is the one they thought who provided the rain, but it's Yahweh who brings rain after 3 to 3.5 years to the parched land. The people had always looked to Baal for their hope, but it's Yahweh who provides it. And the people have cried out, "The Lord is God, Yahweh, He is God." But are they really believing it? Are they going to stay true to it? Are they going to continue to worship? You see, this is a spiritual highlight for Elijah in his life. I think this is a moment he's always going to look back to and know God showed up. This is a moment for the people of Israel where they look back and they say, God showed up. But what's amazing is, let's not use amazing, let's use heartbreaking. We don't see a lot of change from here. The people don't do away with the Baal and Asherah places of worship. They don't step back from their idolatry. You see, this is a spiritual highlight. It's a milestone. It's a marker of God's faithfulness and power. But we don't know how much of a difference it makes in their lives. You sat and you wrote down these moments a few minutes ago about the spiritual highlights in your life. When God seemed most real to you, when your faith seemed strongest and most affirmed, when you felt closer to God than ever before. And I'd love for you to share those. Maybe share that with your friends or your family that you're watching this with. Share that with your small group. Feel free to just reach out and share it with somebody here at the office. And I want you to think about, what difference did that make in your life? Because you're watching this today, so I believe it made a difference. Whether you are the strongest point in your faith you've ever been, or your faith is struggling, or you're probably somewhere in between. But these mile markers, these spiritual highlights, serve as a reminder that God is faithful to us. That God is there, that God shows up, that God can work in some mighty and powerful ways if we simply trust in His goodness. Next week, we're going to look at one of my favorite stories. This is the story that everybody really seems to know, but my favorite story is the one that comes next. Because these spiritual highlights often then come with some valleys. You see, those you can't live on top of a mountain. Eventually, as you head back down, it means going down into valleys of life. But God is still faithful to us in our valleys, as we're going to see as well. So I want you to hold on to these spiritual experiences. And this week, I want you to pray about them and thank God for them. Thank God that He has been showing up and faithful in your life. Hold these in your mind. Be thankful, be praying. Remember what it was like when these things occurred. We're going to remind ourselves of the faithfulness of God, because we need to remind ourselves of that every day. Whether we are in those great moments where we feel closer to God than ever before, or whether we're in those moments of deep despair when we kind of wonder, okay, God, where are you? Because God is always faithful. And let's remind ourselves of His faithfulness. Thanks for being here with me today. Thanks for following along in 1 Kings 18. May God bless you this week. May He guide you. May He turn His face towards you, be gracious to you. May the Lord lift His countenance upon you and give you